The estate of the Whitmore family sat like a scar on the hills of Vermont. Stone walls, wrought iron gates, and manicured gardens masked the rot within. To the townspeople, the Whitmores were old money, patrons of the arts, donors to hospitals, and hosts of lavish galas. But behind the grandeur lay a lineage built on exploitation, secrets, and quiet cruelty. My mother, Eleanor, was their housekeeper for nearly 2 decades. She scrubbed their floors, laundered their linens, and raised their children while they traveled the world. She never complained, not even when they paid her late or docked her wages for imagined infractions. She believed in dignity, in earning her keep. She believed they were good people. I was 12 when she fell ill. It started with fatigue, then nausea, then seizures. Doctors were baffled. Tests were inconclusive. Within months, she was gone. The death certificate cited natural causes, but I knew better. I remembered the day she came home, pale and trembling, whispering about a mistake she had discovered in the Whitmore accounts. She had found evidence of embezzlement, of funds siphoned from the charitable foundation into offshore accounts. She planned to confront them. Days later, she was dead Barnes & Noble. I tried to speak out, to tell the authorities, but who would believe the orphaned son of a servant over the esteemed Whitmores? They dismissed me, warned me to drop it. The Whitmores offered me a scholarship to a boarding school in Switzerland, a generous gesture, they claimed. I saw it for what it was, a bribe, a way to remove me from the picture. I accepted, not because I forgave them, but because I needed time. Time to learn, to grow, to plan. Revenge, I realized, was not a swift blade, but a slow poison. In Switzerland, I immersed myself in genetics, biochemistry, and pathology. I studied hereditary diseases, particularly those that lay dormant for years before manifesting. I became obsessed with the idea of vengeance that spanned generations, institute biotherapies, FRDs. After university, I secured a position at a prestigious research institute. There, I had access to cutting-edge technology, to databases of genetic information, to samples and specimens. I began to craft a pathogen, one tailored to the Whitmore genome. It would be subtle, undetectable, and hereditary. A disease that would pass from parent to child, slowly degrading their bodies, their minds, their legacy. But first, I needed their DNA. I returned to Vermont under the guise of a genealogist researching prominent families. The Whitmores were flattered, eager to showcase their lineage. They provided me with family trees, historical documents, even allowed me to collect saliva samples for ancestry analysis. They didn't recognize me. Time and privilege had blinded them. With their genetic material, I completed my work. The pathogen was a modified virus, engineered to integrate into their DNA and activate a series of mutations over time. Symptoms would be mild at first, fatigue, joint pain, mood swings, but over the years it would lead to organ failure, neurological decline, and death. There would be no cure, no treatment, just a slow, inevitable decay. I introduced the virus into their household through a series of innocuous gifts: a vintage wine, a rare book, a bespoke perfume. Each item was laced with the pathogen, ensuring exposure to every member of the family. Then, I waited. Years passed. The Whitmores began to suffer. Doctors were baffled by the array of symptoms, the lack of response to treatment. Genetic tests revealed nothing unusual. They sought specialists, healers, even psychics. Nothing helped. One by one, they deteriorated. The patriarch, Charles Whitmore, lost his sight and mobility. His wife, Margaret, developed early-onset dementia. Their children suffered from chronic pain, infertility, and depression. Their grandchildren were born with congenital defects. The family's fortune dwindled, consumed by medical bills and failed treatments. Their reputation tarnished, their legacy crumbled. I watched from afar, never intervening, never revealing myself. Justice, I realized, was not always served in courts or through violence. Sometimes it was a whisper in the blood, a curse passed down through generations. And as the last of the Whitmores lay dying, I visited their estate one final time. The once-grad mansion was in disrepair, the gardens overgrown. I stood at my mother's grave, a simple stone in the servants' cemetery, and whispered, "It's done." The wind rustled the leaves, carrying away the last remnants of a family that had thought themselves untouchable. By the time Charles Whitmore's funeral was held, the whispers had grown louder. Rumors spread through the elite circles of Vermont. They spoke of an inherited curse, a genetic flaw festering within the Whitmore bloodline. Doctors' explanations were inconclusive. Theories floated tainted water, rare diseases, bad luck. But deep down, those closest to the family knew the truth was far darker, though they couldn't yet see it. Margaret Whitmore, now a ghost of her former self, was confined to a wheelchair, her mind slipping further each day. I saw her once, shuffling through the corridors of their decaying mansion, talking to shadows. She would mumble about poison, about a boy, but no one listened. Her nurses thought her ramblings were symptoms of dementia. But I knew. I knew exactly who she meant. With Charles gone, his sons, Thomas and Richard, tried to hold the family together. They arranged consultations with specialists, invested in experimental treatments, and threw money at problems they couldn't solve. But their efforts were futile. Their children were already showing signs. Thomas's son Oliver had developed severe joint pain and tremors by his late teens. Richard's daughter Claire suffered from chronic migraines and fainting spells. Their fear was palpable, but they still clung to denial. I returned to Vermont under a different guise. This time, I was Dr. Samuel Carter, a genetics consultant offering my services to troubled families. I gained access to their medical records, their test results, and, most importantly, their fear. I offered reassurances, proposed false solutions, and made them believe I was their last hope. They trusted me, confided in me, even invited me to dinner at their crumbling estate. I walked those halls with a quiet satisfaction. The scent of rot hung in the air, subtle but unmistakable. Tapestries faded, paintings were crooked, and the once pristine floors were scuffed and cracked. The Whitmores still tried to put on a show, but the decay beneath was impossible to ignore. At one of those dinners, I sat across from Thomas and his wife Eleanor, not my mother, but a coincidence that twisted the knife deeper. She was pale, her hands trembling slightly as she cut her food. I watched Oliver excuse himself from the table, clutching his stomach. Claire left early, complaining of blinding headaches. The conversations continued, strained and brittle. I offered polite smiles, knowing the seeds I had planted were blooming. It wasn't enough to simply let them suffer, though. I wanted them to feel the terror, the slow unraveling of their own bodies. So I began to send anonymous letters, carefully worded, hinting at a curse, at a hereditary flaw. They received blood-red envelopes with no return address. Inside were notes scrawled in shaky handwriting. "It's in your blood. The sins of the father. You cannot escape what you've inherited." Panic seeped into their lives. I heard whispers from the staff, from doctors, from acquaintances. The Whitmores became reclusive, paranoid. They fired longtime servants, installed surveillance cameras, and hired private investigators. But nothing uncovered the source of their torment. Nothing could save them. Meanwhile, I expanded my work. It was not enough to target the immediate family. I wanted the rot to spread further, into the extended branches of their lineage. Cousins, nieces, nephews. I traced every Whitmore descendant I could find. Some had already begun to show symptoms, though mild enough to dismiss. I found ways to accelerate the process, an invitation to a charity gala where I mingled among them, shaking hands, sharing drinks, a subtle contamination of their surroundings. A wine bottle slipped into a cousin's wedding celebration, a rare orchid sent as a congratulatory gift to a newborn. Every item was laced with a variant of the pathogen, adjusted to ensure exposure while remaining undetectable. The disease was insidious. It mimicked natural disorders, leaving doctors baffled. Symptoms varied: heart murmurs, chronic fatigue, cognitive decline. But the underlying cause was the same. Each generation carried the silent killer deeper into their veins. and still they had no idea where it had come from. I moved carefully, always a step ahead of their suspicions. The private investigator hired by Thomas reported nothing. Security footage was inconclusive. Every trace of me was clean. The Whitmores were prisoners of their own paranoia, unable to trust doctors, friends, or even each other. Margaret finally succumbed in her sleep, her mind gone, her body a husk. Her funeral was a quiet affair, attended by a dwindling number of family members, most of whom appeared sickly themselves. I watched from a distance, blending into the crowd, listening to their hushed conversations. They spoke of bad luck, of inherited weakness, of tragedies piling upon tragedies. They didn't realize this was no accident. After Margaret's death, Thomas and Richard grew desperate. They liquidated assets, sold off family heirlooms, and downsized their once mighty estate. The Whitmore name, once a symbol of wealth and prestige, had become a curse. I visited the estate once more under the pretense of offering a final consultation. I walked through the crumbling corridors, noting the peeling wallpaper, the scent of mildew. The staff was reduced to a handful of weary servants. Thomas greeted me with hollow eyes and trembling hands. His voice cracked as he spoke of his children's worsening conditions. I offered sympathy, feigned concern, and handed him a dossier of fabricated research suggesting a rare, untreatable genetic disorder. It was a lie, but it planted the final seed of hopelessness. As I left the estate that evening, I glanced back at the mansion silhouetted against the twilight. The Whitmores had tried to bury the truth, to silence my mother, to erase her from their history. But now, their bloodline was poisoned. Their legacy was crumbling. Not with a bang, but with a whisper of decay that would echo through generations. I felt no remorse, only the quiet satisfaction of justice fulfilled. Winter crept in, wrapping the Whitmore estate in a brittle layer of ice and snow. The stone walls, once proud and impenetrable, now felt like tombstones marking the family's slow descent. Even the townspeople, who had once whispered enviously about the Whitmores, now spoke of them in hushed, pitying tones. Rumors of their afflictions, their vanished wealth, and their reclusive behavior spread like frost across the landscape. I no longer needed to hide in shadows. The Whitmores were too broken, too consumed by their unraveling to recognize me. I attended public auctions where their possessions, family heirlooms, priceless art, antique jewelry, were sold off to cover mounting debts. I mingled with the buyers, the vultures circling what was left of the dynasty, and felt a cold thrill as I watched their legacy carved up and sold piece by piece. Thomas, the once proud heir, had grown gaunt, his skin tinged with an unhealthy pallor. His hands trembled constantly and his speech slurred more each time we met. I saw him at a clinic in Boston, slumped in a chair in the waiting room, his head bowed, his breathing shallow. His son Oliver sat beside him, pale and silent. I overheard them discussing the latest in a string of failed treatments, their hope eroding with every appointment. Richard fared no better. His daughter Claire had been admitted to a private hospital for what doctors described as a degenerative neurological condition. She could no longer walk, her speech reduced to guttural murmurs. Richard visited her daily, sitting at her bedside, his suit increasingly rumpled, his hair streaked with gray. One night after leaving the hospital, he stumbled into a bar near the docks and drank until he collapsed. I sat 2 stools away, watching him spiral into oblivion. I was no longer content to simply watch them decay. I wanted them to see the connections, to realize that this was not random misfortune but deliberate retribution. I began leaving subtle reminders. An old photograph of my mother slipped into the mailbox. A letter left on Thomas's windshield reading, "Eleanor's justice is in your blood." These small gestures frayed their remaining nerves, fueling their paranoia. But I wasn't reckless. I always stayed a step ahead, careful to erase traces of my involvement. I knew the patterns of their security, the gaps in their defenses. I had studied every detail of their lives, from their daily routines to their medical histories. I had become a shadow, entwined with their fate. One evening, as the first heavy snowstorm of the season buried the estate under a blanket of white, I found myself at the edge of the property. The lights inside flickered, casting long, distorted shadows against the drifts. The mansion looked less like a fortress and more like a mausoleum, housing the last remnants of a decaying lineage. I slipped through the service entrance, silent as the falling snow. The once impeccable servants' quarters were abandoned, the air thick with dust and mold. I moved through the halls like a ghost, ascending the grand staircase to the upper floors. At the end of a long corridor, I found Oliva's room. The door was ajar, revealing a dim interior where he lay curled on the bed, his face pale and damp with sweat. He stirred at the sound of my approach, his eyes fluttering open. I stood there, silent, watching him struggle to focus. His voice was a raspy whisper. "Who are you?" I stepped into the room, closing the door behind me. "A ghost," I said softly, "from a past your family tried to bury." His eyes widened with a flicker of recognition, too late. I didn't need to explain. The Whitmores had buried too many secrets under layers of lies, and now those secrets were consuming them from within. I left him there, in his own sweat and fear, and descended back into the frozen night. The next day, news spread through the town. Oliver was dead. The official cause, complications from an undiagnosed degenerative disease. The whispers grew louder, accusations swirling beneath the surface. The Whitmores retreated further, their surviving members barricaded in the crumbling estate, afraid to speak, afraid to leave. I continued my work quietly, ensuring that the pathogen's reach extended to the remaining heirs. I found Richard's cousin, a smug financier living in New York, and arranged for an anonymous delivery, a rare bottle of scotch infused with the tailored virus. At a gala in Manhattan, I handed a gift-wrapped box to Thomas's niece, a promising young artist, containing a set of paints contaminated with a variant of the pathogen. Each gift was a seed, planted with meticulous precision, destined to bloom into inevitable suffering. The symptoms spread like cracks in a mirror, small, barely noticeable at first, but deepening and multiplying until the entire reflection shattered. Soon, even distant relatives began experiencing the telltale signs: unexplained fatigue, tremors, memory lapses. The medical community, already baffled by the Whitmore's plight, was now stymied by the widening pattern. I watched as the family tree withered from its roots, its branches snapping one by one. The Whitmore's empire of wealth and influence was now little more than a rotting husk, haunted by memories of what once was. I returned once more to the estate, walking through the snow-covered grounds, past the empty stables and abandoned greenhouses. At the far end of the property, near the overgrown family cemetery, I found my mother's grave. I knelt there, tracing the name on the weathered stone with my gloved hand. "Promise you justice," I whispered, "and they're almost gone. Just a little longer." The wind howled through the skeletal trees, carrying the scent of decay and the promise of an ending. By spring, the Whitmore estate was nearly uninhabitable. Ivy clawed through shattered windows, snowmelt pooled in the halls, and the roof sagged in places where storms had battered it. The remaining family members, Thomas, Richard, and a scattering of cousins, had retreated into the estate's surviving rooms like rats in a sinking ship. I watched them from a distance, knowing they were waiting for salvation that would never come. Thomas no longer resembled the proud, defiant heir he once was. His hair had thinned, his skin hung loose over his bones, and his legs barely supported his weight. His mind was riddled with confusion, his speech fragmented. Doctors had given him no answers, no hope. I heard whispers from the townspeople that Thomas often sat alone in the ruined garden, mumbling to himself, repeating my mother's name without even knowing why. Richard fared worse. Grief and paranoia had eroded what little was left of him. He was found one morning slumped over Claire's hospital bed, her lifeless body curled like a withered flower. He refused to leave her side, babbling about sins and redemption. The hospital eventually forced him out. 2 days later, he was dead. A heart attack claimed him, though I knew it was merely the last crack in a soul already shattered. I stayed close, wrapping up the final strands of my work. There were still a few left, distant cousins and surviving children, scattered like seeds on the wind. I made sure each one received a carefully crafted gift, a wedding bouquet laced with invisible spores, a congratulatory fruit basket sent to a cousin's newborn. Each delivery sealed another branch of the bloodline's fate. No one questioned the mysterious illnesses, not anymore. The Whitmore name was a cautionary tale whispered in drawing rooms and country clubs, a legacy tainted beyond repair. Their wealth was gone, their estate crumbling, their influence reduced to dust. And through it all, I remained a phantom, an unseen hand guiding them to their deserved end. But as the last Whitmore heir, a young woman named Rachel, sickened in her penthouse apartment in Boston, something unexpected stirred in me. I visited her under the guise of a family friend, offering condolences and advice. Rachel was barely in her 30s, her face already drawn with the telltale signs of the hereditary affliction I had engineered. She looked at me with hollow, desperate eyes, unaware that I was the author of her suffering. "I don't understand," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Why is this happening to us? We've done everything we could. Why us?" For a moment, I saw not a Whitmore but a frightened, dying woman, robbed of her future. A surge of doubt twisted in my chest, but then I thought of my mother, of Eleanor's quiet dignity, her loyalty, her strength, and of how they had repaid her with betrayal and silence. I thought of the way they had dismissed me, erased her from memory, and continued their lives as if she had never existed. I leaned in, my voice low and steady. "Because justice doesn't forget," I said. "It's in your blood now. It's always been there, waiting." Rachel stared at me, too weak to respond. Her lips moved, but no words came. I turned and left her to the silence, to the sterile white walls of her apartment. She wouldn't live to see the end of the year. The final phase was complete. The Whitmore bloodline was gone, not with a dramatic flourish, but with a quiet, relentless erasure. Their empire of corruption and cruelty had been reduced to hollow walls, fading memories, and a genetic curse that no amount of wealth or influence could stop. I returned to Vermont one last time, walking the overgrown path through the woods to the Whitmore estate. The mansion was a ruin, windows broken, doors hanging from their hinges, the air thick with mildew and rot. I stepped inside, boots crunching on shattered glass and debris. The walls were streaked with mold. The grand staircase collapsed. I found my way to the parlor where once the Whitmores had held grand galas and whispered about investments and power. There, on the mantel, I placed a single photograph of my mother, Eleanor, in her crisp housekeeper's uniform, her eyes kind and her smile gentle. I traced her image with my finger, then let the photo rest against the cracked marble. This was her justice, her retribution. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. I stood in the garden where once the Whitmores had paraded their wealth, now choked with weeds and vines. I inhaled deeply, letting the scent of decay mix with the fresh spring air. It was done. The Whitmore name, their blood, their legacy, all of it had rotted away. As I turned to leave, I felt no regret, no triumph. Just a quiet, steady satisfaction that justice had been served, not by sword or law, but by a slow, inexorable poison carried through their veins. The wind stirred the leaves, carrying away the last whispers of a family that had once thought itself invincible. I walked away, leaving the estate to crumble into the earth, knowing the Whitmores would never rise again.